Hey everyone, my name is Tony Burke. I'm an FAA senior rigger as well as AFF instructor and coach. And I want to talk today about something that I saw come up on Reddit recently, which is what happens when you pull your cutaway cable before you've initiated deployment and you have an RSL. So just to go over an RSL, reserve static line, that will activate your reserve when your main departs. So if you have a malfunction and you go to cutaway, as your main leaves, the riser has a RSL attachment lanyard here, this thing right here. Now a question came up, what happens if the cutaway handle is pulled before you initiate main deployment? An example of this might be on exit if somehow these cables get snagged on the door, or if someone grabs this by accident, trying to grab your harness and try to grab a gripper, and then instead they hit that by accident and they pull your cutaway handle away. What's going to happen if you have an RSL? The answer is nothing. Nothing will happen. Nothing will be any different in your free fall if you have your cutaway cable pulled, even if you have an RSL. The only difference will happen is when you go to deploy, your main will leave immediately. And if you have an RSL, that will automatically deploy your reserve. If you don't have an RSL attached or don't have one hooked up at all, then you will have to go to reserve yourself. So some people, including myself, when I started out, I wasn't sure on this answer. In fact, I recommended to someone who's going to clean their cutaway cables, oh yeah, you should disconnect your RSL. Turns out you don't need to do that. And I'll show you. So this is my rig. This is an Icon, and this is equipped with an RSL. Now this is equipped with a special type of RSL known as a MARD, Main Assisted Reserve Deployment. The type of MARD that this is called a skyhook. It's probably the most common MARD, but there are other MARDs from other manufacturers, such as the Mojo from Rigging Innovations and a couple others. MARDs operate identically to RSLs when it comes to this lanyard. So this lanyard, sometimes it's on the other side depending on your rig. This lanyard right here, see right here, attaches to so the lanyard attaches here to the riser. So this is what's connecting you to your parachute. So this lanyard goes up through the yoke. And this is the lanyard attachment. Now, this type of rig is built so that it can take a skyhook. In fact, the skyhook is actually installed on this one. There are non-skyhook rigs that look exactly like this, and then a lot of RSL rigs will look different than this. You'll have, the pin will be a little bit different, but it's essentially the same. When your main departs, and only when your main departs, the lanyard will come at stretch, and we'll pull this, and then that will pull the reserve pin there. And that's how an RSL works. That's how a MARD works. So the difference between an RSL and a MARD is that with an RSL, after it pulls the reserve pin, its job is done completely. It doesn't do anything more. With a MARD, when the pin is pulled, then the MARD will also attempt to extract the free bag from the reserve pack tray. With a MARD, the reserve pilot chute will also attempt to extract the reserve free bag from the pack tray, and it's kind of a race to see which one wins, but one of them will win. They've tested this over and over again, and typically it's going to be the MARD the main leaving will actually pull the free bag out for you. So just to show you that it will not happen, so my RSL is attached, it's hooked up. Show you that nothing happens. So let's say I'm on exit, I've got my RSL attached, and someone thinks they're grabbing a gripper, but they grab my cutaway handle instead, and they pull it, and nothing happens. Because this is not attached to my reserve in any way. It's the RSL lanyard that is attached. That does not activate the RSL until the riser leaves the container. And that is the only thing that will activate the RSL. So on most rigs, there are 3 ways to activate the reserve. Number 1 is if the AAD activates it. So it cuts the main closing loop and then reserve comes out. Number 2 is you activate the reserve by pulling on your reserve ripcord. This thing right here. And number 3 is if the RSL lanyard pulls the reserve pin for you. And that's only because the riser has left. The riser is attached to this RSL lanyard, and the RSL lanyard gets pulled and then pulls the pin. So again, just to clarify, pulling your cutaway handle at any stage in the skydive, other than when there's something above your head, will not deploy the reserve. So if you have not initiated main deployment yet, and everything normally is where it normally is, pulling the cutaway cable will not activate your RSL. It will not deploy your reserve. The only thing that activates the RSL is the riser leaving the container.
Okay, there's an addendum to this video. So a couple of people asked, either on Facebook or in the comments below, so what would happen if you actually did have your cutaway cable pulled before you went to deploy? So maybe on exit, or someone grabbed you, docked you pretty hard, and pulled your cutaway cable, and you were aware of it. What do you do? Well, you can either go to your main, or you can go right to reserve. Going right to reserve would save you from having to find out where your main drifted off to and your free bag, but both would work. So for example, let's say you weren't even aware that your cutaway cable had been pulled and was no longer there. If you have an RSL, you deploy, your main would deploy fully, and all of a sudden your risers would leave. The riser leaving would pull your reserve pin, that's the RSL, and then you would have a reserve deployment, and you'd be kind of confused, being like, why is my reserve up there instead of my main? But you would be okay. If you went right to reserve, you just go right to reserve. Your main would still stay in the main pack tray, and you would have a reserve over your head. The important thing is that if you do have your cutaway cable pulled prematurely before it's time to deploy your main or reserve, that you pull something. So just if you brain lock and you're like, oh crap, what do I do? And you during track off, you think, oh, I'll just deploy to my main, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Same thing if you go right to reserve. If you have the wherewithal, going right to reserve just is a little bit more convenient, but the most important thing is to pull something.